People in Pine Ridge Hollow like things simple. Simple houses, simple routines, simple beliefs. The town sat tucked between low mountain ridges in western North Carolina, the kind of place where the road narrowed as you drove in and widened again only when you left. Folks here believed in straight lines and familiar shapes, straight fences, straight walls, straight answers to complicated questions. That was why Ethan Walker stood out. At 16, Ethan wasn't loud or rebellious. He didn't get into trouble. He didn't sneak out at night or talk back to adults. In fact, most days people barely noticed him at all, until they did. He lived alone in a weathered trailer at the edge of town, the one his parents had bought before they died in a winter car accident 3 years earlier. Since then, Ethan had learned to cook for himself, chop his own firewood, and stretch $1 longer than most grown men in Pine Ridge Hollow. What people noticed wasn't what he said, it was what he watched. Ethan watched the way wind slid down the mountain slopes instead of crashing straight through them. He watched how rain pooled at corners, how ice formed thickest where walls met at sharp angles. He watched how the old oak trees, rounded, bent, scarred by decades of storms, still stood long after newer, straighter trees had snapped and fallen. While other kids his age played pickup basketball behind the gas station or talked about leaving town someday, Ethan sat on overturned buckets with a notebook balanced on his knee, sketching shapes that didn't look like anything most people recognized. Circles, curves, arcs. At school, teachers called him quiet. Classmates called him weird. The older folks called him that Walker boy, with a tone that suggested trouble without ever naming it. He's got his head in the clouds, some said. Reads too many books, others muttered. Poor kid's been off since his folks passed. Maybe all of that was true. But what no one ever asked was why Ethan watched the world so closely. Every night after dinner, he pulled a battered cardboard box from beneath his bed. Inside were notebooks filled with yellowed pages, tight handwriting, and hand-drawn diagrams. They had belonged to his father, and before that, to his grandfather, a man Ethan barely remembered except for his hands. Big, steady hands that could fix anything if you gave them time. The notebooks weren't novels. They weren't journals. They were filled with observations, notes about storms, sketches of buildings, clippings from old magazines about engineering, physics, and weather patterns. Ethan didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough to feel uneasy. Storms were changing. They didn't behave the way people expected anymore. And Pine Ridge Hollow was not ready. One cold October afternoon, while the rest of town prepared for winter the way they always had, Ethan made a decision that would quietly mark him as an outsider for good. He started clearing land behind the trailer. Not much, just a small patch near the tree line, where the ground rose slightly and the soil felt dense beneath his boots. He measured carefully, pacing the earth, marking spots with small wooden stakes. Then he hauled out salvaged lumber, old metal sheets, and tools he'd collected over years of fixing what others threw away. When Frank Miller, the town's longtime carpenter, drove by in his rusted pickup, he slowed down and stared. "What in the world are you building out here, son?" Frank called. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. "A shelter." Frank laughed, not cruelly, but confidently. The way someone laughs when they're sure they already know the answer. "You planning to live underground or something?" "No," Ethan said, "not underground." Frank squinted at the stakes, the strange layout. "Those lines don't look right." "They're not lines," Ethan replied quietly. "They're guides." "For what?" Ethan hesitated. He'd learned that explaining things too early only made people stop listening faster. "For something that won't break," he finally said. Frank shook his head, chuckling as he drove off. Kid's got an imagination, I'll give him that. Word spread fast in Pine Ridge Hollow. By the end of the week, people slowed their cars when passing Ethan's land. Some stared openly, others whispered. A few kids laughed when they thought he couldn't hear. "Looks like he's building a giant beehive." "No, man, it's a UFO landing pad." "My dad says nothing round ever lasts out here." Ethan heard all of it. He didn't respond. Instead, he worked. He worked through cold mornings and early sunsets, hands raw, muscles aching. He studied the ground, adjusted angles, scrapped plans that didn't feel right. Every decision weighed on him, not because he was stubborn, but because he was afraid of being wrong. Not for himself, for what might come. Late one evening, as the sky burned orange and purple over the ridge, Lucas Reed, one of the few people in town who still spoke to Ethan, stopped by. "You okay, man?" Lucas asked, leaning against a tree. People are talking. Ethan nodded. They always do. Lucas glanced at the strange curved framework beginning to take shape. You gonna tell me what this is really about? Ethan paused. The wind shifted, brushing through the leaves in a low, restless whisper. I'm not building for today, he said finally. I'm building for the day when today stops making sense. Lucas frowned. You expecting something bad? Ethan looked toward the mountains, their rounded silhouettes dark against the fading sky. I don't know when, he said. I just know. Not yet doesn't mean never. Lucas didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He just stood there, uneasy, feeling that quiet chill you get when someone says something that sticks with you longer than you want it to. And as the sun disappeared behind the ridge, Ethan kept working, alone, determined, and completely out of step with the world around him. Unnoticed by most, misunderstood by many, but preparing for something no one else believed could ever happen. By mid-October, Ethan Walker's project was no longer just a curiosity. It had become entertainment. Every small town has a rhythm, an unspoken agreement about what's normal and what isn't. In Pine Ridge Hollow, that rhythm had been the same for generations. People built square houses because their parents had built square houses. They trusted corners, right angles, and methods that had always worked. Ethan was breaking that rhythm. The curved framework rising behind his trailer looked wrong to people. Not dangerous, not threatening, just wrong. And in places like Pine Ridge Hollow, wrong made people uncomfortable. They started stopping by uninvited. Some came pretending to be helpful. Others came because boredom needed a target. One afternoon, as Ethan wrestled a heated wooden beam into place, he heard clapping behind him. Would you look at that, Frank Miller said, standing with two other men near the tree line. I'll be damned. He really is serious. Ethan didn't turn around. Kid, Frank continued louder now, you know you're making things harder on yourself, right? Ethan tightened the clamps and waited for the wood to cool before answering. Harder doesn't mean weaker. That earned a laugh. Listen to him, one of the men said. Sounds like he swallowed a textbook. Frank shook his head, half smiling. You trying to prove something, Ethan? Ethan finally turned. His face was calm, but his eyes were tired. I'm trying to build something that lasts. Frank gestured toward the town, barely visible through the trees. Those houses lasted just fine. Ethan didn't argue. He'd learned that arguing only hardened people's positions. Instead, he went back to his work. Frank watched for a moment longer, then sighed. Suit yourself, son. Just don't expect folks to take you seriously. That was the problem. They already didn't. At the gas station, people talked. At his age, he should be thinking about work, not fairy tale buildings. My cousin says round structures trap heat weird. Kid's gonna freeze come winter. The whispers followed Ethan everywhere. At the grocery store, at school, even at church where people smiled kindly but kept their distance, as if odd ideas might be contagious. The pressure didn't explode all at once. It pressed in slowly. Every sideways glance, every joke, every reminder that being different came with a cost. Some nights, alone in his trailer, Ethan stared at the ceiling and wondered if they were right. He was exhausted, behind on stocking firewood, behind on food prep. He had one unfinished project demanding everything he had, and winter was coming fast. Fear crept in quietly. What if I'm wrong? But then he'd open his father's notebooks again. He'd see sketches of curved surfaces, notes about pressure distribution, simple observations written in careful handwriting. Force looks for edges. Corners fail first. Those pages didn't promise safety. They didn't guarantee survival. They just made sense. So Ethan kept going. The day the steam box collapsed nearly broke him. He'd spent weeks building it from scrap wood and salvaged metal. His way of bending beams without cracking them. One bad joint, one moment of impatience, and the whole thing caved in on itself with a sharp crack. Ethan sat in the dirt afterward, staring at the wreckage. His hands shook, not from cold, from doubt. That was when Lucas Reed showed up again. Rough day? Lucas asked quietly. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. You could say that. Lucas crouched beside him. You ever think about stopping? Ethan didn't answer right away. I think about stopping every day, he finally said. I just think about something else more. Lucas followed his gaze to the half-built structure. The curves were unmistakable now. Intentional. Defiant. What happens if nothing ever comes? Lucas asked. If you build all this, and the bad day never shows up? Ethan swallowed. Then I wasted time. And if you don't build it? Ethan's jaw tightened. Then I might waste lives. Lucas didn't have a comeback for that. Neither did anyone else. By late October, the structure was tall enough to draw attention from across the road. Kids rode their bikes past just to stare. Adults slowed their trucks. Some people stopped laughing. They started worrying. At a town meeting, Frank Miller finally said it out loud. "That boy's building like he knows something we don't." The room went quiet. Someone scoffed. "You think a 16-year-old figured out something the rest of us missed?" Frank rubbed his chin. "I think he's either dead wrong or dead serious." That was the first crack. Not in the building. In the town's certainty, Ethan felt the shift, even if no one said anything to him directly. People watched more closely now. Less mocking, more measuring. He worked longer hours, cut back on sleep. His movements grew sharper, more urgent. He didn't talk about what he felt building in the air, how the wind seemed heavier lately, how the silence before storms lingered longer than it should. He just kept shaping wood into curves and hoping the world would give him enough time to finish. Because deep down, Ethan wasn't afraid of being laughed at anymore. He was afraid of being too late. And as October bled into November, Pine Ridge Hollow continued on as it always had, unaware that the ground beneath its certainty was already starting to shift. November arrived without asking permission. It slipped into Pine Ridge Hollow quietly, the way trouble often does. No storms, no sirens, just a subtle shift in the air that most people didn't notice because they weren't looking for it. Ethan noticed. He felt it first in his ears, a dull pressure that came and went without warning. He noticed it in the way the wind behaved, not stronger, but stranger. It didn't rush through the valley like it used to. It lingered, circled, slid along the ridges as if testing the land. The birds noticed too. One morning, Ethan stepped outside his trailer and realized how quiet it was. No crows arguing in the trees, no distant rustle of wings, just stillness. Thick, uneasy stillness. He pulled one of his father's notebooks from his jacket pocket and flipped to a page he'd marked months earlier. Rapid pressure change. Unseasonal warmth followed by sharp cold. Silence before violent rotation. Ethan closed the notebook and looked up at the sky. It didn't look wrong yet. That was what scared him most. At school, teachers complained about students losing focus. At the gas station, people mentioned headaches, restless sleep, dogs barking at nothing. Small things. Easy to ignore. Ethan couldn't ignore them. He worked faster now. The curved walls of the shelter were nearly complete, rising solid and smooth from the earth. The structure no longer looked like a joke. It looked intentional, thoughtful, permanent, still unfinished, but close. That closeness haunted him. One afternoon, Lucas Reed found Ethan sitting on a stack of lumber, staring at the sky instead of working. "You all right?" Lucas asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "Do you feel that?" Lucas frowned. "Feel what?" Ethan struggled to explain. "Like the air's waiting." Lucas laughed uneasily. "You've been spending too much time alone, man." "Maybe," Ethan said, but he didn't smile. That same evening, Ethan walked into town for supplies. The trading post buzzed with early winter talk. Salt, firewood, heating oil, life going on the way it always had. Frank Miller stood near the counter, talking with a few men. "Never seen November this warm," one said. Frank shrugged. "Weather's been weird for years now." Another man laughed. "Don't tell that to the kid building the round bunker. He'll say it's the end of the world." A few chuckles followed. Ethan stopped in the doorway. Frank noticed him and cleared his throat. "Evening, Ethan." "Evening," Ethan replied. There was an awkward pause. Frank shifted his weight. "You, making good progress out there?" "Yes, sir." Frank hesitated, then surprised everyone, including himself. "You think winter's going to be rough?" Ethan looked him in the eye. "I think winter won't be the problem." The room fell quiet. Frank forced a laugh. "Well, that's comforting." Ethan didn't stay long after that. That night he dreamed of wind. Not sound, not movement, but pressure. A crushing force with no face, no direction. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, the words from his notebook echoing in his mind. Rotation doesn't announce itself. The next few days brought more signs. Clouds stretched into long, unnatural bands across the sky, like someone had dragged fingers through wet paint. The light took on a pale greenish tint in the afternoons that made shadows look sickly and wrong. Old Mrs. Harper swore her arthritis was acting up worse than ever. Dogs whined through the night. Even Frank admitted his workshop doors rattled when there was no wind. Still, no one said the word. Storm. Ethan finished the roof framework just as the temperature dropped sharply. One day it was mild enough to work in a flannel shirt. The next, frost clung to the ground before sunrise. The shift was violent, unnatural. Ethan climbed onto the roof to secure the last support beam, his breath fogging in the cold air. From that height, he could see the whole town. Rows of square houses, straight lines, right angles. Comforting shapes. Fragile shapes. Lucas stood below, watching. "You sure you don't want help?" he called up. Ethan shook his head. "I need it done a certain way." Lucas nodded, though he didn't fully understand. "People are nervous," he said. "They don't know why." Ethan tightened a bolt. "Neither do I. I just know it's coming." Lucas swallowed. "Coming how?" Ethan climbed down slowly, his movements careful. "Fast." The next morning, the birds were gone completely. Not quiet. Gone. Ethan stood outside his shelter, scanning the tree line. His skin prickled. He grabbed his notebook again, flipping pages with shaking fingers. Then he saw it. The clouds weren't drifting anymore. They were stacking, layer upon layer, moving in different directions at once. Low clouds raced beneath higher ones, twisting the sky into something that didn't belong over Pine Ridge Hollow. Ethan felt fear then, not panic, but a deep, grounded certainty. This wasn't a storm that passed. This was a storm that chose. He ran, not away, but toward his shelter. As he worked, hammering, securing, sealing every seam, the first low thunder rolled across the valley. It didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the earth. Lucas appeared again, breathless. "Ethan, Frank says the pressure dropped like a rock. People are starting to worry." Ethan didn't stop working. "They should." Lucas stared at him. "Should we tell people to?" A sudden gust cut him off, ripping loose leaves into the air. Ethan looked up at the sky, now bruised purple and green. "It's too late to tell them what to think," he said quietly. "All we can do now is be ready." The wind shifted again, stronger this time. And somewhere far off, beyond the ridges, something began to move. At 3:42 p.m., the wind changed. Not gradually, not politely. It snapped, like a rope pulled tight and suddenly cut loose. Ethan felt it in his bones before he saw anything. A violent shift in pressure that made his ears ring and his chest feel hollow, as if the air had been scooped out of him. He froze for half a second, standing outside the shelter, staring at the sky that had turned an unnatural shade of green-gray. This was it. He didn't think. He moved. "Lucas," Ethan shouted, already running. "Get inside!" Lucas stood 20 yards away, eyes locked on the western ridge. "Ethan, what the hell is that?" The sound reached them before the sight did. A low roar, distant but growing fast, like a freight train barreling through the mountains with nowhere to stop. Ethan grabbed Lucas by the arm and dragged him toward the shelter. "Don't look at it! Move!" The first debris hit the ground hard enough to shake their feet. Leaves, dirt, broken branches, everything lifted and twisted in the air, like the land itself had turned against them. Across Pine Ridge Hollow, people poured out of their homes in confusion and fear. Frank Miller burst from his workshop, wiping his hands on his jeans, squinting at the sky. "That ain't right," he muttered. Someone screamed, and then they saw it. The funnel dropped from the clouds like a living thing. Dark, massive, spinning with terrifying purpose. It wasn't thin or elegant like the ones on television. This one was wide, heavy, hungry. A tornado. In November. In the mountains. The rules people trusted shattered in that instant. "Get to the church!" someone yelled. "Basements!" another screamed. "Run!" Panic spread faster than the storm itself. Ethan shoved Lucas through the round doorway and slammed it shut behind them. The wind hit the shelter like a wall of fists, but instead of crashing, it slid, screamed, around the curved exterior. Lucas stumbled inside, eyes wide, breathing hard. "Ethan, this thing—" "I know," Ethan said, forcing the door latch into place. His hands shook, but his movements were steady. "Just stay low." The roar intensified, swallowing every other sound. Wood splintered somewhere nearby. A sharp crack echoed, followed by a deep, gut-wrenching boom. Outside, Pine Ridge Hollow was coming apart. Frank Miller's workshop lifted from its foundation as if it weighed nothing. Walls peeled away, boards tearing loose and spinning into the sky like matchsticks. A pickup truck flipped end over end, disappearing into the storm. The church bell rang once, then went silent. Inside the shelter, the air vibrated. The walls groaned, flexing under pressure that no straight structure could have survived. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The floor trembled beneath their feet. Lucas covered his head, yelling something Ethan couldn't hear. Ethan pressed his palms against the curved wall, eyes closed, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to do something, but there was nothing left to do now. This was the test. The wind circled the shelter, furious, relentless. It searched for corners, edges, weaknesses. There were none. The force slid around the structure, wrapping and unwrapping itself, unable to grab hold. The curved walls redirected the pressure, spreading it evenly instead of letting it concentrate and tear the building apart. Ethan felt it, felt the theory become reality. Then came the worst moment. A sudden impact slammed into the door, hard enough to throw both of them to the floor. The latch rattled violently. The shelter shuddered. Lucas screamed. Ethan lunged forward, bracing his shoulder against the door. He could hear debris striking it, metal, wood, God knows what, hammering again and again. "Hold!" Ethan shouted, though he didn't know who he was talking to. Himself, the building, the universe. Seconds stretched into something else, something endless. The roar reached a pitch so loud it stopped sounding like noise and started feeling like pain. And then, silence. Not gradual, sudden, so complete it rang. Ethan opened his eyes. His ears rang. His body felt hollow, light. He waited, afraid to move, afraid the storm was just catching its breath. But it didn't come back. Slowly, carefully, Ethan stood. The shelter was still there. The walls still curved. The roof still intact. Lucas stared at him, disbelief etched across his face. "Are we alive?" Ethan nodded, throat tight. "Yeah." They waited another minute before Ethan unlatched the door. It took effort to push it open. What greeted them outside didn't feel real. Pine Ridge Hollow was gone. Not damaged, not scattered. Gone. The tornado had carved a path straight through the town, leaving bare earth and twisted debris where houses once stood. Foundations were exposed like bones. Trees were snapped or stripped clean, their bark torn away. Frank Miller's workshop was nowhere to be seen. The gas station, gone. The church, reduced to rubble. Ethan stepped out slowly, his legs weak. People emerged from ditches, from behind rocks, from wherever they'd managed to survive. Some were bleeding, some were crying, some just stood there, staring, unable to process what they were seeing. Frank Miller staggered toward them, a cut on his forehead, eyes wild. He stopped short when he saw the shelter, standing, untouched. "How?" Frank whispered. His voice cracked. "How is this still here?" Ethan looked at the curved walls, at the door that had held. "Because the wind couldn't grab it," he said quietly. Frank reached out, touching the wall as if expecting it to vanish. "All these years," he murmured. "All these damn years building square, thinking stronger meant thicker." His eyes filled with tears. "And the kid we laughed at." More survivors gathered, drawn to the only structure left standing. They pressed close, not just for safety, but for understanding. Ethan didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow, because being right had come at a cost no one should have had to pay. The sky slowly cleared as evening approached, sunlight breaking through the torn clouds and casting long shadows across the ruins of Pine Ridge Hollow. And in the center of it all stood a curved shelter built by a 16-year-old boy who had listened when the world tried to warn him, while everyone else was too busy laughing. The silence after the storm was worse than the noise. It pressed down on Pine Ridge Hollow like a heavy blanket, thick with dust and disbelief. No wind, no birds, just the crackle of distant fires and the soft, broken sounds of people trying to breathe through shock. Ethan stood outside the shelter, staring at what used to be his town. He had imagined this moment before, had imagined proof, validation, the quiet satisfaction of being right. What he felt instead was grief. People moved like ghosts through the wreckage, stepping carefully, afraid the ground itself might give way. Some called out names. Others didn't speak at all. A few simply sat down where their homes had been and stared at nothing. Lucas emerged from the shelter behind him, his face pale. "I keep thinking it's going to start again," he said. Ethan nodded. "Me too." Word spread quickly that the curved shelter was intact. Survivors drifted toward it, one by one at first, then in clusters, drawn not just by safety, but by something they didn't yet understand. By nightfall, more than a dozen people had gathered around it. Frank Miller sat on a fallen beam nearby, his head in his hands. When Ethan approached, Frank looked up, eyes red and unfocused. "I spent 40 years building things I thought were solid," Frank said hoarsely. Taught my boy the same way. Taught everyone. He swallowed hard. I laughed at you. Ethan didn't know what to say. He hadn't prepared for this part. You couldn't have known, he finally said. Frank shook his head. You knew enough. A woman named Sarah, who had lost her house and nearly lost her husband, stood nearby listening. Why didn't you tell us harder? She asked. Not accusing, just broken. Ethan felt the weight of the question settle on his chest. I tried, he said quietly. But people don't hear warnings that don't fit the world they're used to. No one argued with that. As the temperature dropped, Ethan opened the shelter to everyone. The interior was cramped but warm. The curved walls seemed to hold the heat close, wrapping the space in a steady, even comfort that felt almost unreal after what they'd been through. People pressed together, strangers who had lived side by side for years but never truly seen one another. Fear stripped away distance. Loss stripped away pride. A child began to cry softly. Someone hummed to calm her. Frank watched the way the heat moved, the way no corner stayed cold, the way the shelter breathed instead of fought the air. It's different, he murmured. Ethan nodded. Different doesn't mean fragile. Outside, emergency lights flickered as county crews finally reached the valley. Radios crackled with stunned voices reporting damage that didn't make sense. A tornado in November in the mountains. Experts would explain it later. Charts and probabilities would try to make it understandable. None of that mattered right now. What mattered was survival. The next morning, sunlight revealed the full scope of the destruction. The tornado's path cut clean and brutal through Pine Ridge Hollow, sparing almost nothing. Square houses had collapsed inward. Roofs were gone. Walls torn open. The shelter stood alone, curved and calm, like it had always belonged there. People gathered around it again, touching the walls, running hands along the smooth arcs as if confirming it was real. Lucas watched Ethan from a distance. They're looking at you like you've got answers. Ethan sighed. I don't have answers, just observations. Sometimes that's enough, Lucas said. Frank approached again, this time with purpose in his step. Show me, he said. Show you what? How you built it, Frank replied. The steam box, the curves, the measurements, all of it. Ethan hesitated. Why? Frank's voice broke. Because I don't want to bury anyone else for the same mistake. That was when something shifted, not just in Frank, but in the town. Rebuilding didn't start with hammers and nails. It started with questions. Why did corners fail first? Why did the wind slide instead of slam? Why had strength been confused with stiffness for so long? Ethan answered what he could. When he didn't know, he said so. He pulled out his father's notebooks, spreading them on a makeshift table, explaining sketches in plain language. No lectures, no, I told you so. Just shared understanding. Some people resisted. They clung to what was familiar, even after watching it fail. Ethan didn't push them. He understood fear well enough to respect it. But others listened. Frank became his shadow, asking questions late into the night, practicing bending wood the way Ethan showed him. Lucas helped gather materials. Neighbors who had never spoken more than a nod now worked side by side. The shelter wasn't just a building anymore. It was a gathering point, a classroom, a reminder. One evening as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, Sarah approached Ethan again. You saved my kids, she said softly. Ethan shook his head. I just built a thing. She met his eyes. You built a chance. That stayed with him. For the first time since his parents died, Ethan felt something unfamiliar take root beneath the grief and exhaustion. Belonging. Not because he was right, but because he was useful. The town that had once whispered about him now watched closely. Not with mockery, but with respect mixed with regret. They didn't see a strange kid anymore. They saw someone who had paid attention when it mattered. And as plans for rebuilding slowly took shape, one truth settled deep into Pine Ridge Hollow. The storm hadn't just torn their town apart. It had exposed the cracks in the way they thought. And in those cracks, something new was beginning to grow. Rebuilding Pine Ridge Hollow didn't begin with blueprints. It began with hesitation. For weeks after the storm, people lived in temporary shelters, borrowed campers and borrowed patience. The land still looked wounded, raw patches of earth where homes had been, splintered trees like broken ribs sticking out of the ground. But the deeper damage wasn't visible. It lived in people's confidence. The old certainty that if you did things the way they'd always been done, you'd be fine, was gone. Ethan noticed it in the way folks talked now. Conversations were slower. Questions replaced assumptions. Even disagreements sounded different. Less sharp, more careful. Frank Miller was the first to act. He stood one morning beside the wreckage of his old workshop, hands on his hips, staring at the open space where straight walls had failed him. Then he turned to Ethan. "Show me again," he said, "from the beginning." They started small. A steam box, rebuilt stronger than the last. Curved beams bent carefully, patiently, coaxed into shape instead of forced. Frank's movements were clumsy at first, his frustration obvious, but he didn't quit. Neither did Ethan. Neighbors gathered to watch. Some offered help, others just stood quietly absorbing the process. People asked questions, not challenging ones, but curious ones. Why does the curve matter so much? What happens if the wind hits from the side? Does it cost more? Ethan answered in plain language. He didn't talk like a teacher. He talked like someone who'd learned by paying attention. The wind looks for something to push against, he explained one afternoon. If you don't give it that, it moves on. Not everyone was convinced. A few folks insisted on rebuilding exactly what they'd lost. Same layouts, same angles, same habits. Ethan didn't argue. He understood that fear made people cling to familiarity, even when it had failed them. But something had shifted. Even the ones who rebuilt square began reinforcing corners differently. Rounding edges, changing roof lines. Small changes, but intentional ones. Lucas Reed noticed it first. "You didn't just change buildings," he said to Ethan one evening. "You changed how people decide." Ethan shrugged. They changed themselves. As weeks turned into months, Pine Ridge Hollow slowly came back to life. New structures rose from the ground, some curved, some not, but none built blindly. Every design carried the memory of what had happened. Children helped measure and carry tools. Teenagers asked to learn how the steam box worked. Frank's son, once skeptical, spent hours practicing bends, his hands blistered but determined. The shelter remained the heart of it all. People still gathered there, sometimes to plan, sometimes to talk, sometimes just to sit in a space that felt safe. Stories were shared there. Apologies, too. One afternoon, Sarah approached Ethan again, watching the new walls rise across the valley. "You know," she said, "I used to think being strong meant standing your ground." Ethan nodded. "Most people do." She smiled sadly. "Now I think it means knowing when to move with the pressure instead of fighting it." That idea spread faster than any blueprint. County officials came to inspect the damage. Engineers asked questions. One of them, a quiet woman with a notebook full of calculations, stood inside the shelter for a long time, tracing the curve of the wall with her eyes. "You didn't just build a structure," she told Ethan. "You built a system that understands force." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He thought of his father's notebooks, his grandfather's handwriting, the long line of quiet observation that had led him here. "I just listened," he said. By spring, Pine Ridge Hollow looked different. Not prettier, not bigger, wiser. There were fewer jokes now about weird ideas. Fewer easy laughs at what didn't fit. People remembered the cost of certainty. Ethan still lived in his trailer, though Lucas kept pushing him to build something permanent. "You've earned it," Lucas said. "Maybe," Ethan replied, "but I don't need much." What he needed, he already had. Purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the ridges glowed gold, Frank sat beside Ethan on a stack of lumber. "I spent my life teaching people answers," Frank said quietly. "Turns out I should have been teaching questions." Ethan smiled. "You still are." Frank nodded, watching the curves take shape across the town. "Funny thing is, I'm not afraid anymore." Ethan looked at him. "Of storms?" "Of being wrong," Frank said. That might have been the most important rebuilding of all. Because Pine Ridge Hollow hadn't just survived a storm. It had learned. Learned that strength wasn't stiffness. That tradition wasn't truth. That listening, really listening, could save lives. And as the town stood on the edge of summer, rebuilding with hands scarred and minds open, one thing was clear. The storm had passed. But its lesson was staying. Years passed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, the way real change always does. Pine Ridge Hollow never became famous. There were no documentaries filmed there. No roadside signs bragging about survival or innovation. To the outside world, it remained just another small mountain town tucked between ridges and trees. But to the people who lived there, it was no longer the same place. The curves stayed. Some homes were fully rounded now. Others carried softer edges, angled roofs, reinforced joints, subtle nods to a lesson learned the hard way. No one argued anymore about whether the storm had been a fluke. They didn't need to. They had seen what happened when certainty went unchallenged. Ethan Walker grew older, though not in the way people expected. He never chased attention, never tried to turn his work into a business empire. He stayed rooted in Pine Ridge Hollow, training those who wanted to learn and stepping back when they didn't. He built slowly, thoughtfully. People from neighboring towns came by sometimes, curious. They asked questions about shapes, about wind, about whether it was really worth the extra effort. Ethan always gave the same answer. Worth is what you decide before the storm, not after. Frank Miller didn't live long enough to see all of it, but long enough to see enough. Before he passed, he left behind a workshop filled with curved frames and half-finished experiments. His son took over, teaching apprentices not just how to build, but how to doubt their own assumptions. Lucas Reed eventually moved away for a while, but he came back. Most people did. Pine Ridge Hollow had a way of pulling people home once they understood it wasn't just a place anymore. It was a reminder. One autumn afternoon, years after the storm, Ethan stood beside the original shelter, the one that had started it all. Time had weathered the exterior, turning the wood a soft gray. The door had been rebuilt twice, the roof once, but the walls were the same, still curved, still steady. A group of local kids stood nearby, listening as Ethan explained how pressure moved, how forces behaved when they weren't challenged head-on. Their eyes were bright, not with fear, but with curiosity. One of them asked, "So, you knew the storm was coming?" Ethan shook his head. "No." Another kid frowned. "Then how did you know what to build?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I didn't know what was coming. I just knew the world doesn't owe us predictability." That answer lingered. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone, watching the sun drop behind the ridgeline. The wind moved gently through the valley, calm now, almost friendly. He thought about his parents, about his father's notebooks and his grandfather's steady hands, about the nights he'd doubted himself, the laughter he'd endured, the lives that had been lost before anyone was ready to listen. He didn't think of himself as a hero. Heroes act once. What Ethan had done was quieter and harder. He had paid attention when it would have been easier not to. Pine Ridge Hollow learned that strength wasn't about resisting change. It was about adapting before you were forced to, about asking uncomfortable questions while things still felt comfortable. That lesson didn't just apply to buildings. It applied to people, to families, to communities, to anyone standing on the edge of a decision telling themselves not yet. Because not yet doesn't mean never. It just means you still have time. Time to prepare, time to rethink, time to listen to the quiet warnings we're so good at ignoring. And that's the real story Pine Ridge Hollow carried forward. Not the storm, not the destruction, but the choice to change before the next one came. So here's the question for you. If the storm came to your life tomorrow, not wind and rain, but loss, change, or the unexpected, would you be ready? Are you building for today, or for the moment when today stops making sense? If this story made you think, made you pause, or made you see the world a little differently, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful, emotional stories about resilience, second chances, and the quiet strength it takes to think differently before it's too late. Because the stories that change us the most aren't about disasters. They're about the people who prepared when everyone else was still laughing.